Hello and welcome everybody to New Earth Consciousness. Tanya here with Dan Cohen. He is the author of Awakenings in Real Life, and he also has a podcast, same name, Awakenings in Real Life. You can find his website at awakeningsinreallife.com. And yeah, I am so excited to have you here today because we're going to dive into a topic that I don't think is really, it's not really talked about.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I really very much appreciate and I look forward to the conversation. And yes, everything I do is called Awakenings in Real Life because in my last work life, I was an entrepreneur and a branding guy. So there's a theme to my second career, so
Hmm.
to speak. So, yes, I wrote a book called Awakenings in Real Life. My dad's awakening from dementia woke me up too. So, have you had any experience with a family member or a loved one that had Alzheimer's or dementia in your life, Tanya?
No, I this is such an important topic, and I feel like what often happens to families is that we get physically separated. And so for me, growing up, our family, my nuclear family, was so far away from my grandparents, my aunts, and my uncles. It was like, huge traveling distances if we were to ever see them. And so, unfortunately, the only person, my aunt and uncle both had Alzheimer's pretty severely. I never witnessed that. My grandmother eventually came down with dementia, but she lived in Mexico City. So, it becomes a real, I think, financial challenge for a lot of people whose
Yeah,
families are separated because it's so costly to travel. So and it's something that I feel quite sad about actually. And I feel like that's just kind of the way our culture just steamrolls on ahead. And I feel like this topic is so important because we're so groomed and conditioned to always be forward looking, and we tend to venerate youth and
yeah,
vitality, and everything else just gets like literally thrown in the garbage. I feel like, it gets swept away behind closed doors. So yeah, I mean,
you're right.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I lived about 2 hours from my parents. So they lived in Long Island, New York, and I eventually had moved to New Jersey where I was raising my family. And there was a couple of bridges in between. I know people that wouldn't travel over a bridge, you know, and 2 hours seems like a big distance. To me, it wasn't. I didn't make it I sometimes went in a day back and forth. I felt it was important to see them, but a lot of people, even with that distance, they
Mhm.
don't see their loved ones as often as possible. So I agree with you that
Yeah.
it's tougher today when family members are located in different areas of the country.
Mhm.
But you're right, Alzheimer's, and most people are familiar with Alzheimer's. There's so many people suffering it today. So my father didn't actually have Alzheimer's, he had dementia. And a lot of people don't understand the distinction. So dementia is actually the symptoms you get from Alzheimer's. So dementia is a cognitive decline and it goes over time and it's irreversible and it runs in stages
Mhm.
from 1 to 7. So the beginning stages can really resemble, just aging. You lose a word here or there. You might forget your keys here or there. But
Mhm.
as it goes over time, it's a loss of mental cognition. People lose their short-term memory. That's a very big part of it. And then over time, it can lead to loss of physical function because the brain controls the body. So Alzheimer's, which most people are familiar with, is plaque in the brain. But you can get dementia a number of different ways. Certain illnesses can lead to dementia. People, what they used to call senility, which is a hardening of the arteries, which is vascular dementia, can lead to dementia. Then there's, frontal temporal dementia and things like that. And then you could get it from like a blow to the head.
Mm,
And
mm,
that's what happened to my father. He had a stroke when he turned 75 that led to his dementia. And again, it runs in stages. And when I speak to people, I don't, if they ask me, should we know what stage our loved one is in? And that's a personal decision. For me, I didn't really have the urgency to go to neurologists and said, is he in stage 4? Is he in stage 6? Is he in stage 7? You know what's going on with your loved one, especially if you're close and you see them on a regular basis. I didn't feel I needed the extra angst to know exactly what stage he was at. I think the family, especially if you're in the family is close, they're going to know better than the neurologist what your loved one or whoever is going through and where they're at. So I didn't feel the need to know exactly which stage he's at. Some people do, but I didn't need to know exactly. But that's a personal decision. But it does run in stages, and what's very hard is because a person going through dementia, it's like seeing them fade. It's like they're fading before your eyes.
mm,
It's someone that you love. It's almost like mourning someone who's living, which
mhm,
is a very difficult thing. And in our case, my father was a very, very big presence in my life. So from a young man to an older man, he always had that role in my life. He was my hero, my confidant, a problem solver, my best friend, a man I consulted in various areas of life. It's funny because I wrote this book, Awakenings in Real Life, which is about his awakenings from dementia, but there are other family stories and what I call mini awakenings. And the last chapter of my book I call is Who is Your One? And I said that everybody in life hopefully has that one person who has no ego when it comes to you. They want you to succeed, and they don't care if your success is greater than their success. They typically love you unconditionally. It could be a hero or not a hero. And I also think there's no statute of limitations on having that person in your life. I remember going through COVID, and my father had passed away at the time, and I said to a friend, boy, I really wish I had my father to speak to. And his response was, well, we are our fathers. We've grown with certain wisdom. We have our children of our own. We know how to handle our problems. And yeah, that's true, but I don't think there's ever a time in life when you don't need that person in your life to look up to. So he was that guy for me. As much as I love my mother and I loved my mother, he
mhm,
played a very important role in my life. He was a big personality. He was a man who, my brother likes to say, exuded love,
mm,
very demonstratively loving, especially towards his wife and his 3 children. So to see his dementia, which came from the stroke, a downward turn, it's very difficult as a family member
yeah.
to see that.
I have to say you're really blessed because I feel like so few men have father fathers who they can say that they look up to as a role model. So that's profound, and I can imagine that seeing his decline must have been, yeah, heart-wrenching. And so I'm curious, well, if you could share with the audience that moment of that awakening when you realize,
Sure.
right? I mean, many people feel that when someone has dementia or Alzheimer's, that they're gone, that they're just not there, that they're practically a vegetable, and there's nothing to relate to anymore, so or connect with.
Exactly right. And by the way, if your statement, if that's true, I find it sad. I remember, I think President George Bush, his father was his hero. I remember seeing a news conference with Tom Brady, the football player, and a young man said to him, "Who's your hero?" And with tears in his eyes, he talked about his father.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's not so uncommon, but men shouldn't always have to be so tough. It's okay to have
Yeah.
someone to
Yeah.
rely on in life, right? So the interesting thing to me, before I tell you the exact moment that happened, is I used to think, oh boy, nobody on this planet can have the relationship I had with my father. It's so special. It made me feel so special. And I know he has two other children. So 5 months before his stroke, we made him a surprise 75th birthday party. And everyone from my mother down to the youngest grandchildren was able to talk to my father and tell him how he felt. And it was really special because 5 months later he had the stroke. But I was listening to my brother, and my brother and I are very different personality wise. And I always thought I'm very similar to my father. And the first thing he said is, everybody tells me I'm just like my father. I said, how's that? We're so different. And then when he explained it, they looked more alike than I did with my father. They had lots of things in common. He told three great stories he had with my father growing up. And then my sister spoke, and there's a lot of, in my family, a lot of men. There wasn't so many females. So my sister, um, the two boys, and then she came along and she used to say, "Oh, my friends all love my father. He's so warm to him." But can you imagine being Herbie's little girl, you know? And then she sung a song to him. So I said, wow, they feel exactly the same way I do. He had that ability to make everybody feel loved and special. So another one of my chapters in my book, another one of my mini wake is called Perspectives. And I recount this story about, we all look at our life through our own lens, right? And we don't often look how and appreciate other people's perspective. But was at that party, I said, wow, they feel the same way about him as I do. And I never really appreciated that much. And I said to myself, if we as a society can really appreciate other people's opinions and perspectives, we'd have so much more empathy for people and we'd get along better. Even on a political scale, it's such volatility and viciousness that nobody looks at other people's opinions. So that was eye-opening for me. And that's why my father's awakening not only affected me, but especially my siblings and my brother. So you're right. So he was going through the dementia and um, he was 10 years in and it went the course. So
Mm.
so in 2015, he was probably in the last stage or next to last stage. He was incontinent. He was wearing a Depends. Couldn't really eat regular foods. The ability to swallow was gone. So we were eating pureed foods. Basically not verbal. He wouldn't initiate a conversation. Maybe you'd get a word or two, but never initiate a conversation. He typically, for the most part, knew who we were. A lot of times there's no recognition at all. There were times he didn't. I think that was a great blessing he gave to the family because I think that would have been the real toughest thing. Although I hear there are moments of recognition, but that would have been really hard if he never knew us at all.
Mm.
When he would be bathed or shaved, he would cry out in pain. Very
Mm.
difficult to hear your parent cry out in pain
Mm. Wow.
when they're not in pain.
Mm-hmm.
He was pretty much amiable. A lot of times, a person with dementia, they become mean or ornery, and the family doesn't really recognize them.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right when you say a lot of people think they're on a different planet.
Mm-hmm.
So um, when I was in a support group and someone wrote, "Wow, isn't it wonderful that my parent with Alzheimer's, they're in their own world and they're happy in their own world." And that makes sense, but that's not been my experience or what I learned from his awakening. I tell people that are going through this two things, acceptance and inclusion. And the first thing, and I'll get into the story in a minute, dementia runs in stages in a negative way, where so people will repeat the same thing over and over. They'll ask you to re they'll ask you to repeat things. They'll ask the same question over and over. people will say my loved one was so much better 6 months before, but that's right, because it's a negative downward turn. You, as a caregiver, as a family member, you got to accept your person wherever they're at. Our natural tendency as human beings is to challenge someone or to say, you asked me that 14 times already. Or don't you remember I already told you that? So
Mm,
when someone's going through it, their brain is screwed up. It's not your loved one. It's a part of their brain that's messed up. If you can accept that and accept them where they're at,
mm,
it'll be so much better for you in your relationship. And to give yourself, to accept yourself and give yourself some grace that you're not always going to be perfect. Sometimes it's going to be frustrating. Sometimes you're going to mess up, but allow yourself that grace and do the best you can. And the other thing that I preach to someone is while your person is still on this planet, include them in whatever you can do. So even before my father had his awakening, and I'll explain to you why that reinversed my thought, I just would go to my parents once a week or every other week, and I take them to a movie and lunch. And then when he couldn't leave the house, we'd watch a movie on TV and eat together. And I knew that 5 minutes after he left the theater, he wouldn't even remember what the movie was. Okay. But sometimes in the course of the movie, especially if it's a sad one, I could see the tears in his eyes. So
mm,
he was there in the moment.
mm,
So I always believed you include them. You're going out to dinner if you can get them and you could take them. And that was reinforced when we went through the awakening. So I like to write some articles. So before we had the actual awakening, I wrote an article that says, I wish I could flip a switch and wake up my father. I know he's still in there. I always felt in my heart of hearts that he was still there, that somehow he was still there. And even at the very end, when I would come to visit him, he would just hold my hand and kiss it.
mm,
That was the essence of who he was.
mm,
He was a very loving man. And that was enough for me at that point, even though he wasn't this big personality he had. So we had a very unique experience that I don't know if anybody else has. I know people have moments of clarity with there's someone with them. We actually had a 2-day awakening. So in the summer of 2015, 8 months before my father passed away, he was hospitalized twice for pneumonia. The second time, he was also hypertensive, which I think is a lack of steroids. So they treated him with high dose of steroids and antibiotics. And he was in the hospital. And at this point, he was as I described you. And I walked into his room. My brother's a doctor, so he was there a lot too. I walked into his room and he says, Hi, Danny. And I said automatically, Hi, Dad. He says, I love you very much. And I said, I love you very much. He said, What happened to me? I said, Well, you have pneumonia, you're being treated, and hopefully you'll go home soon. And then it dawned on me, this is not the man that I just saw a few days earlier in the throes and the depths of late stage dementia. This is like my father who I grew up with. And I was just answering him as I would in any conversation. He would always say how much he loved me. Even on every phone call, he would leave it, I love you to pieces. And it was remarkable. And if I had to put it in percentages, I would say he was 90% the man he was. My brother, now remember, I told you he felt the same way about my father as I did.
mm,
He said it was his hair stood up on his head. It was one of the most seminal moments of his life. And he wouldn't put it in percentages, but he said 1 minute he was gone, and the next minute he was back, speaking in full sentences and clearly and answering everything um, completely. So it was really remarkable. And we had 48 hours where he was himself, and we experienced some really tremendous things.
mm.
Should I share some of those
Yeah,
things
please.
with you?
Yeah.
So at one point, because the grandchildren, for the most part, he was going through this for 10 years, were younger, and when they were younger, they couldn't appreciate him as much. We were filling him in on what they're doing because a lot had changed in the 10 years. And he would say, wow, that's great. That's remarkable. I always knew this one could do that. And
Mm,
then he said, isn't one of the grandsons in school? And didn't another grandson start Ivy League school? And we said, yeah, Dad. And then we realized those events happened during the midst of dementia. So this was not something that happened beforehand. This happened while he was in the throes of dementia. And he also knew what hospital he was in with nobody telling him from the circumstances. So my brother and I said, how do you know that? If a person without, we never know what a person with Alzheimer's or dementia is there. And you described it. A lot of people think that they're living on a different planet.
mm,
But the fact that he knew that two grandchildren were starting these schools led us to believe, and I believe, that people in dementia are probably more aware of their circumstances than most people think.
mm,
So if you believe that, then you will treat your person as a part of life. You will include them in life. You will take them to family occasions. You'll take them to dinner. You'll take them places because they're probably more aware than we think. I think, and you probably have experienced in your podcast, I think we can't appreciate the ability of the human consciousness or the human spirit and what people are capable of. Um, you hear stories about people in comas, right? And what do the doctors tell the family members? Talk to your loved one. They could hear you,
mm,
right? And then you hear stories occasionally of people coming out of a coma and repeating back what something said to them while in their coma. So I think you never can estimate the human spirit and the human brain and the human consciousness. And uh, and I think this applies not only to people going through Alzheimer's or dementia, but other mental conditions or other physical conditions. The things that we learned as a family, I think, can apply across the board. And I try to broaden my book to say it doesn't matter what your mental condition is or physical condition, accept your loved one for who they are and include them in life, which I think is very important.
mm,
So my mother, who lived with him and experienced it the most, also had some wonderful experience. And I'll tell you something interesting, and maybe you can help me explain it. So she lived with him the most, but she was the last one to really come to terms with his dementia.
mm.
I don't know why. Why? Do you have any thoughts as to why she
And
was
she couldn't accept it or
right? She was almost like in denial, I think,
yeah.
and she couldn't accept it. And she still thought he had, because he was a great problem solver, and I tell stories about that. He had great ability to accomplish and solve problems, but she was the last one to get it. And maybe it's denial, but I thought that was very interesting that she was there and experienced the most, but she was the last one to come to terms with it.
Mm,
Anyway, my parents were married 62 years at the time. And he says to my mother, you're the love of my life.
mm,
And she hadn't heard those words in 10 years. So it was remarkable. Now, my father had certain quirks growing up. So he liked to take naps. And if he took a nap during the day and it wasn't a completely dark room because the sun was shining in, he would take a long black or brown sock, right? And put it across his eyes and he would take a nap. He's lying in the hospital bed and he's called my mother Arl. He says, Arl, do you have my sock? I want to take a nap.
that's funny.
You can't write this stuff.
Yeah.
He also in life was a generous guy. He was a very good tipper. If you did something nice for him in a service industry, he appreciated it. He showed it through tip. He would tip people that wouldn't even expect tips. And it didn't matter where he was on whether we were middle, lower middle, whatever it was, he was always a generous guy.
Hmm.
So he's lying in the hospital and he says to my mother, oh, do you have any cash? She says, what do you need cash for? You're in the hospital. Because I want to tip the nurses and the aides
Mm,
that were so nice to us. So it was incredible. It really was remarkable. He reminisced with my brother and I, mainly my brother, about he was a boxer in the army. He was 26-0, and how he was underestimated by his opponents and he surprised his opponents. He reminisced about some of his favorite football players. He loved a New York Jets football player. We were in New York that was undersized, that had a great career. And he remembered the holiday picture. He took with all the grandchildren. He bought them all this jersey, number 80, and I have a great family picture. And with tears in his eyes, he remembered that picture and he talked about, he says, like this football player, I was underestimated
mm,
in my career. So we had some really remarkable, and it was just like having our father back. So I tried to get my children there because I wanted them to see grandpa like that. And unfortunately, they couldn't get there till the end of the second day. And he really reverted back to his full dementia at that time.
mm,
But my brother was smart enough to videotape some of it.
mm,
So my daughter was pretty emotional, and we showed my children this tape. And this really was the catalyst for everything I've done afterwards. My brother asked him, "What are you happy about?" He said, this is verbatim. I'm happy just to be here and alive. I'm happy just to be here and alive. And I think in that moment, he was telling the family that even in the midst of dementia, I appreciate life and I want to live.
mm.
And I thought that was really very profound, especially for the family. So we're trying to figure out why it happened, right? And my brother, the doctor, was looking for a medical explanation. His first theory was the steroids reduced the inflammation in his brain and it caused him to have a temporary awakening. And I said to myself, how's that possible? It's an irreversible downward condition. So I'm doing a podcast on other people's awakenings. He was my first guest. So in the 10 years, he did more research and said, no, steroids can have a negative effect.
Mm,
He thought it'd have something to do with my father's dopamine levels or neurotransmitters. I don't know. I don't buy it. Maybe it's some sort of miracle.
mm,
And I'm not a religious guy, but I didn't put it past that that was the case because his neurologist said he never saw anything like it in 30 years of practice.
mm,
My brother consulted his colleagues. They never saw anything in like practice. People before they pass, they have something called terminal lucidity. They wake up, but that's right before they pass. This was 8 months prior. People with dementia or Alzheimer's have moments of clarity, but not 2 full days. And then we said, well, look, he's a fighter. He's a fighter his whole life. There were times he was in the hospital. My brother would say, I'm not sure he's going to make it through the night. And he miraculously recovered.
mm,
So I put those theories in my book, but then I did a little book signing, and a friend of mine came up to me and said, you know why I think your father went through what he did? He did it so you could write about it and share his story and give people hope. And I like that explanation best because before I wrote the book, while he's still writing, I put out an article on medium.com about the story. And I didn't know what kind of reaction I was going to get.
mhm,
And to this day, there's over 300,000 views. So it still resonates, the article. And where a lot of people said it's very touching and heartbreaking, the family between you and your dad, a lot of people said, boy, this gives me hope. Then my person, especially with dementia or mental phys, still appreciates life and wants to live. And that really made it very meaningful for me, more than just an incredible story, but a story that I could share and hope and give hope to other people. And those are the type of comments I got. So
Interesting.
originally,
You had a lot of people with their own stories that connected with you and
yeah, exactly. There were a lot of stories as well. And I only wrote the article at the time, and I was
yeah.
still working. I'm an entrepreneur, and I didn't have any thought of writing a book till I finished my last consulting gig. And I said, you know what? I'd like to write a book and share my dad's story, maybe reach a wider audience. I said, but I don't think this story enough is alone to fill up a whole book. So I said, we got other great family stories, especially about my father and some other family members, and I'll put that in the book. And I was found an editor of very indie publishing house in California. They are wonderful people. And when I was reflecting back and speaking to my editor, she said, you know what? When you reflected on your father's awakening, it allowed you to reflect back on other family stories. And you're telling me things that you learned lessons from these stories. And what I thought about it was almost like mini awakenings. And I said, I'm going to share the stories. So I share about the acceptance and the inclusion as part of the dementia treatment, but I tell stories of how small acts of kindness have meaning. And we experienced that with my father. I had an uncle that always showed up in our lives. We would go away and we'd come in 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon, always met us at the airport. Half the time, I don't even think he knew what flight we was on. He just always showed up. Always was very involved. He was a bat, so very involved, almost like a second parent, the importance of showing up. So when I wrote the, perspectives like I talked about earlier, so then I wanted in my book, I add um, pages of reflection. So I give the audience the ability. I said, how hasn't you accepting what you're loving is going through made your life easier? When has including them in life benefited you? When is an act of kindness um, being meaningful? Share those stories and reflect in the book. I'm trying to bring the reader into the story by allowing them to share their own reflections, and I give them prompts. So that's been a very nice thing too that people have in my reviews have commented on the ability to reflect and bring it back to their own life. And again, I don't, although this is certainly going to resonate with people having Alzheimer's or dementia, it applies to people that are, parents that are aging. It can apply to people in various mental conditions,
Mhm.
people going through cancer or other physical conditions. I think these things that I learned and share can resonate. And I try to share some funny stories as well. And that's what I try to accomplish in the book. And I want to get it out there so hopefully people can be entertained by the story and interested, but maybe learn some things from it as well.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it makes, as you're speaking, it makes me think of Bert Hellinger and what he talked about when it came to like orders of love. And basically, he said that our parents give us life.
Right.
And as they age and get older, it is right and appropriate that the children then take care of the parents. And that cycle is it's so important. It's so, I don't know what the word is, regenerative, or
Yeah.
just it's like the natural evolution of life and how it should be carried. And that's profound. There's just an honoring that I think is so important that we make that choice. Now, I know that some people, my personal experience has been is that, sometimes aging parents can be very resistant to wanting to receive the support of their children. I
Yeah.
don't know if it's a pride thing or what,
Yeah. It's a
but
pride thing.
yeah.
Until they get to the point where they really can't say no.
Yeah, yeah. And so,
I
I,
remember my father, it was in the early stages, and we went to an elder care attorney. We wanted to protect his.
mhm,
He wouldn't transfer any of, well, he still had some, he wouldn't transfer any of his money, anything at
yeah,
that point because it was like a loss of dignity is on until he got to the point where he just agreed,
yeah.
and I
Yes,
understand that.
there has to be the timing and all of that where Yeah, it's tricky. It's not an easy transition to make. It certainly is a sort of a rite of passage. That's for sure. Um,
Let me just share something with you if I can about
sure, yeah.
aging parents, and you're right. So I have a chapter in the book, I call it A Living Eulogy for My Father. And you've been to funerals in your life, right? And I've been to funerals and I've had both my parents passed away. I had some contemporaries pass away, but I've been to funerals of people I know and people I don't know because I'll know their child, whatever. And I listen to these eulogies. And even if it's someone I didn't know, I'm always brought to tears. Okay. And then all of a sudden I said, boy, the person who should be hearing those words is the past person who passed away. So I urge people while your loved one is living, and it doesn't only have to be a parent or an elderly person, it can be a contemporary, it could be a friend. Share. You know, we tell people we love them. We tell people you did a good job. We'll have various things. But when do you really sit down with someone, especially parents, and really share how you feel with them? I had the opportunity at a 75th party to do so.
Mhm.
But when I turned 40, I was feeling very nostalgic. I wrote my parents a letter, a 4 or 5 page handwritten note, and they said that was the best birthday present they ever got. Um, Send an email if you want, write a handwritten letter, or do a video, sit down with your person, share what you feel about someone while they're here so you don't have not regrets, but you don't have to make the speech when they passed that
Yeah,
really they would appreciate the most. So that has to do with
I
aging
love that.
too.
I love that. That's very inspiring and meaningful. I mean that's the thing, right? Life is the meaning we give it. And if we
Right.
want to have rich lives, then there's devotion, there's something that you have to give in order to receive the fullness of life. And so I love that you shared that idea with the audience because I just
Yeah.
can't
We
imagine
all,
how healing that would be inside of those relationships.
Yeah, I really it just and the it's as you'll feel as good telling the person as they'll feel receiving it. And and a lot of this is, you hear stories about we were fortunate. He was a very loving, demonstrative man. My mother was not as demonstrative, loving. It's interesting.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, but he had that he rubbed off on her, and he
Mm.
was a street kind of guy, never went to college. She was more educated. That rubbed off on her. But yeah, people get caught up in their lives, especially when you then have your own children, and then, I remember hearing an actor once, he got some award. He said, do something, pick up the phone, call your parent, they're waiting to hear from you,
Yeah.
but if you can do it, do it. And it doesn't matter. You love someone, share how you feel about them. They'll
Yeah.
really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you had, I would say to the audience as well, like even if you had let's say a difficult relationship with a
Yeah.
parent, you can find, if you dig deep enough, you can find something that you can thank them for, even if it's just that they gave you life. Um,
I yeah. Um I I don't know what it is, but I think this generation, sometimes with parents and children, there's a lot more estrangement than with my generation. I don't know why exactly. I find that sad. Or, I have friends that don't speak to siblings. And I find that sad too. My hope is always that my children become best friends.
Mhm.
Because I remember once hearing someone speak and says it was actually in temple, and the rabbi said to the children there, "Who are you closest to in this planet?" And the kids were, "My mommy, my daddy." He said, "No, it's your brother or your sister. You both share the same genes
Mhm.
from your parents." So I find it sad when I hear siblings or parents and children really not conversing. I find that sad, and then something happens and they regret it and don't,
Yeah,
especially sad.
life,
But
life is short. Life
and
is
you know
short.
what? And what I don't want the audience to get or you get, my father was not a perfect man.
Mhm.
Okay. He wasn't. I might, in my eyes, he was great. But believe me, he had his flaws. He made his mistakes like anybody else. And that may be the difference between the one and the hero is then this person who typically loves you unconditionally, may not be perfect, but they play that role for you. And I hope everybody has that person in their life, no matter because it's a loss when you lose that person. Then you hope you have a 1A or a B, someone else. But um, and if it's not going to be your children, because hopefully you are for them, and it could be a contempt, but usually a parent or a mentor of some sort. So it's interesting. This book is really like, a love letter to my dad, you
Mhm.
know.
Mhm.
And the guy who was he was my biggest fan, whatever I did, business or little league. He was, he saved my first win as a player and my first no-hitter, and he would have been going crazy. Every review that came in, he would have been thought was the greatest thing on the planet. So,
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Dan, for being here and for really just, you know, sharing your message, and that to bring hope to people who are caring for their loved ones who are going through the decline of dementia and Alzheimer's, and that it's really it's a powerful message because I'm sure many people they don't know that potentially their loved one could be still receiving and present
right.
on some level, and
Yeah.
that is I'm sure that's going to wake some people up who are listening to this.
I hope so. I hope so. And the feedback I've gotten is it has.
Yeah,
So that makes me
amazing.
feel good. And there's just briefly, you mentioned that I do a podcast too,
Hmm.
right? And I wasn't planning to do a podcast. Just quickly, I saw a story about a guy who had a spinal condition, decided to leave his corporate life, learn how to sail across the Pacific Ocean. His story went viral on social media. He was interviewed all over the place. I said, boy, this guy had an awakening in his life. He changed his life 360. I said, there must be tremendous stories about there of people going through different awakenings and overcoming illness and disabilities and trauma and near-death experiences. And I'm not shy. I want to share these stories because they also have messages of hope. And I found people with various awakenings, a guy who was a skydiver and he jumped out of a plane, broke his neck, and had a near-death experience and his awakening. I've had a couple women experience terrible trauma, and then their awakening moment was, I'm going to take it and turn it and help other people.
Mhm.
I had someone who lost a son, and his awakening was he wrote a book called Carry On to help other parents. A guy who was bullied his whole life, right? At 46 years old, he decides, I'm going to become a clown, a humanitarian clown, and spread joy and goodness all over the world. A man who wanted to be invisible as a youth to now be as visible as possible. So
Mhm.
there are tremendous stories of an awakening, people think of as a religious and spiritual. And
Right,
there are those stories.
sure.
And it's also defined as like a waking up. So my father almost woke up, but it's also a recognition, realization, or awareness of something. So there's some tremendous stories out there, people who really have gone through things and and it could be a light bulb moment or it can be an awakening over time
Mm.
and stories of hope and I share some of those in my podcast as well. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so you can find the link to that podcast at awakeningsinreallife.com.
right.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the audience for listening and watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, especially share it with people that you know who are in a caregiving role. Such an important and profound message for people to hear.
I really appreciate it. I so appreciate you having me on. I know, the one that, it's not easy to do a podcast, as you know, and the beautiful thing about it is you never know you could have someone halfway across the world that comes across your podcast. It's
Yeah.
a tremendous thing. It's given people like you and I the opportunity to share stories that people might not hear. So I give you a lot of credit for doing that. And I know you've had your own story that you've shared with me as well, which is pretty amazing. And what you do too.
Yeah.
I applaud you for that. And I so appreciate you giving me the time to talk about our story.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. All right, everyone, be well, be blessed, and until next time, have a beautiful rest of your day.